Hello from Washington, D.C. I want to thank the speakers and participants for taking the time and energy to discuss some of the challenges we face on our public lands. Your work this week is important. Here in the United States Senate, I serve on the Energy and Natural Resource Committee. We oversee the activities of the Forest Service, the BLM, and the Park Service. We're seeing tough new challenges facing our public lands, but few solutions getting any traction. Land use, demographics, and the West are changing. It's uncertain whether our laws still match the needs of our public lands. The cost of fighting fires is devastating the Forest Service. BLM struggles to address the rapid increase in motorized recreation, and the Park Service has been underfunded for far too long. Everyone seems frustrated, but that's where opportunity lies. Folks in Montana have long been at the forefront of steering the direction of public land management. That's why earlier this year I asked the School of Forestry at the University of Montana to put together an assessment of problems they see facing the Forest Service. They're releasing their initial findings this afternoon. I hope the report is just the beginning of a larger process and public conversation that gets the Forest Service back on track. One that brings together forestry professionals and stakeholders to come up with a new direction for the agency. It will be a lively debate, and it should be. One thing is clear though, Montana should help lead this national discussion. The problems facing our public lands are tough, but we have much to be hopeful about. Montanans are blessed with a tradition of living, working, and playing in the outdoors. We're proud of that heritage. That's why some folks across the state are working to break the gridlock between timber and conservationists and motorized users. They are finding agreement over how we manage our public lands. I can't stress enough how important this work is to Montanans and to the nation. Today I want to tell you, people are listening. Not just in Missoula or Montana, but in Washington too. That's why your work at this conference is so important. I'm looking for ideas from the ground up that can work for our local communities and the nation as a whole. Thank you, and stay in touch.
I'd like to thank Tracy Stone Manning for delivering this video from Jon Tester today. And with that, we're going to kick off our next panel, and I think Jen is going to introduce our next lineup of panelists.
So the next panel is Keeping the Public in Public Lands. It's going to discuss current issues in public access like hunting, fishing, recreation, wildlife management, and privatization of public resources. And our moderator and introducer is going to be Amy Webbink, who is currently a clerk for Judge Harkin, but was formerly a senior attorney for the Government Accountability Office, where she dealt a lot with public land issues.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to serve as moderator for this panel, Keeping the Public in Public Lands. As a former natural resources and environmental attorney for the United States Government Accountability Office, and as a current resident of Missoula, I have a keen interest not only in how we maintain public's access to public lands, but also in how we retain the character of those public lands. Striking the right balance between those two issues, as any land manager knows, and as I'm sure all of you know, is difficult and often generates much controversy. We must keep in mind, as we've discussed today, that what constitutes appropriate public access is driven by the specific statutory frameworks under which the public lands are governed. For example, the national parks are managed for the purpose of conserving and protecting park resources, leaving them unimpaired for future generations, while, as we have discussed, multiple use principles and sustained yield principles guide the national forest management. Yet even with these statutory frameworks in place, if we surveyed just the people in this room, I'm sure we would get very different perspectives on what it means to keep the public in public lands and on what constitutes appropriate public access. For example, do you agree that Yellowstone's winter use plan and the snowmobile use permitted therein is inconsistent with the conservation mandate of the park, as Judge Sullivan of the District Court of the District of Columbia held just last week? Or do you anxiously await the District Court of Wyoming's decision in the companion case or an appeal overturning that conclusion? Do you believe that recreation fees constitute a double tax on the American taxpayer, which should be eliminated? Or in a time of tightening budgets, do you think that this provides a valuable source of funds to the land management agencies? And finally, should we drill, baby, drill? Or is it your hope that more public lands will be protected from drilling? In sum, there's no shortage of controversy on the issue of public access to public lands. And this panel will consider current issues surrounding public access, as well as issues of devolution and privatization of public resources. First, we'll hear from Gloria Flora, former supervisor of the Lewis and Clark National Forest, and now the executive director of Sustainable Obtainable Solutions, a nonprofit in Helena dedicated to the sustainability of public lands. Gloria will share her expertise and thoughts about the value of public lands, the recent Yellowstone decision, and recreation fees. Please welcome Gloria.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is a fun topic. I was very excited that I got asked to speak on this one. The issues that are surrounding access, and I'm talking about physical and verbal access to public lands, to the management of public lands, is really a hugely significant issue, and not only for now, but also for future generations. And these issues tend to touch people individually. So some issues are large and people get involved with them, but it's not really something that they experience personally, whereas access really is. First, I wanted to set the stage for you. Consider that the population of the United States, I think as of July of last year, was 302 million people. That's an increase of about 7% a year since 2000. And in 1958, just 50 years ago, there were only 178 million people. Then if you look at the amount of federal land that the U.S. government owns or manages, my figures said about a little over 500 million. And Karen had some figures this morning that said 672. But let's just go with 500 for instance. If you take out the military lands, which we really don't have access to, it figures out to about 1.5 acres per person in the United States. Now, how would you feel if you only had access to and influence over 1.5 acres of land? That is the beauty of public land. These lands are held collectively so that each of us have access to millions of acres of land. These lands are held in collective ownership in trust for future generations so that we can enjoy resources and benefit from resources now, but also enjoying them in a way that allows them to be available for future generations. Because our responsibility, and indeed the responsibility of every generation, is to ensure that these lands are managed sustainably. I called this speech Access to the Priced, the Priceable, and the Priceless. And I want to talk a little bit about public lands in those three categories. The priced commodities, the ones we're very familiar with, timber, minerals, etc. We have a real treasure trove on public lands, and we have benefited greatly from accessing this treasure trove. Energy, minerals, utility sightings, recreation, there's some forms of recreation. These are all priceable, and for over 100 years we've been meeting the needs and demands of a growing nation. Indeed, demands keep rising as population rises and also as our affluence rises. This departure from sustainability, I think, was very clearly, as Karen identified this morning, noticeable just post-World War II. The Forest Service really, in particular, I'll talk about the Forest Service because it's what I know about best, we have this real can-do attitude. But the do became more important than sustain in terms of the verb. Paul Hart, in his book Conspiracy of Optimism, really described this phenomenon really well. It wasn't any bad intent or a decision, well, forget sustainability, let's just go whole hog. No, it was the idea that we can. Look at the technology, look at the demand, we can meet this demand. And this spirit of doing versus sustaining really captured the the public land managers. And what that has led to, though, is a focus primarily on priced goods as a measure of the adequacy and indeed the appropriateness of activities on federal lands. And it's only until recently that we really started to look at pricing other things like hunting and fishing and tourism, recreation, outfitting and guiding. Indeed, there was a study that just came out, I think it was in July, or no, it was actually in the beginning of September, Alaska, pricing the value of national forest lands in Alaska, $2.7 billion annually in revenue from these items that I just mentioned, the tourism, the hunting, the fishing, outfitting and guiding. Huge source of income. Very happy to see that now in the priced column. But there's also the priceable, and my colleague Reed Watson, being an environmental ecologist or environmental economist, I'll get it right, is certainly in a wonderful position to talk about this. But the value of natural capital. Natural capital means the goods and the services that nature provides basically for free that humans can't really replicate, and that's creating oxygen, sequestering CO2. Think of a tree. A tree we used to price as price per board foot. If you could cut it down, chop it up in little pieces, then it was worth something. It is worth so much more standing in situ. It produces oxygen, it absorbs CO2, it provides food for animals and even for people, it provides shelter and habitat for animals large and small, prevents erosion, holds soil in place. It's a very important contributor to the hydrogen cycle and also to feeding microorganisms and keeping the nutrient cycle going. The tree is worth a tremendous amount of money. Now, also, think about vegetation in general. There really isn't any other process on our entire planet where energy is converted into durable mass. That's what plants do. That has huge value. We haven't learned how to replicate that. If you listen to environmental economists, they'll tell you that the Earth provides anywhere from $16 trillion to $54 trillion worth of natural services every year. The whole economy in a year on the globe is about 10 trillion. So nature outdoes us once more. So you have these priceable services, but they don't tend to get a whole lot of airplay or figure prominently in decisions. And then you have what I call the priceless. And here we start to talk about the human dimensions of ecosystems, the relationship of humans to their landscapes, how we feel and interact with a place. Humans want goods, the priced, they want services, the priceable, but they want experiences. That's what's really important to humans in the context of public lands. And on public lands, they want to use them not only to connect with their heritage, but they want to create memories today, and they want to contribute to a legacy. Also, the ability to find beauty, meaning, and solitude in public lands is absolutely priceless. You say, well, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, or, blah, blah, blah. No, excuse me. Think about what nature has inspired that has created a richness to our culture that is absolutely unmatched. The music, the poetry, the prose, the paintings, the photography that have all been inspired by nature and largely our public lands has added something to our society and our civilization that we could never match in any other way. Now, when somebody is on their deathbed, and this is always kind of my measure of what's important, if you're on your deathbed and somebody says, well, what do you remember about what you got from public lands? They're not going to say, I think 5% of my meat came from cattle grazed on public lands. They're not going to say, oh, I think that part of my front porch came from wood from public land. No, they're going to say, I remember going fishing with my kids. I remember when my grandpa took me up into the mountains and we got up on the top and we could see forever. That's what people really love about public lands, and it's something that we have considered priceless, and what that has been interpreted to mean is it has no value because it doesn't have a price. So, let's see, I think I was supposed to talk about access issues, wasn't I? This is all related, very important. Again, I want to talk about access, physical and verbal access in the context of the price, the priceable, and the priceless. Let's talk first about the verbal access, the ability to provide input. I'll tell you, we are very, very lucky in the United States. Just looking to our north, to our neighbor Canada, they have the ability to comment, the public has the ability to comment on things that are happening or proposed for public land, but the government has no responsibility or legal binding regulation that requires them to listen at all. And they're very fond of slap suits, so that if you want to challenge someone legally, you are going to be, if you're going up, say, against an oil company, you are going to have to pay their legal fees if the decision is not in your favor. So you can imagine a small nonprofit making the choice to litigate. So we are very fortunate here that we do have regulations that allow us to participate and have our voice heard, and at least be explained why we weren't listened to. You know, the Forest Service for many years, and I would hope that they still don't do this, but for many years has this invitation to participate in, verbally in projects, and they say, you know, we welcome your input, and we would like it to be substantive and scientific. And what that means is that anything that's priceless is not in that list, and therefore it doesn't count. There's a lot of debate also about what level this input should take place on. Should it be local? Should it be national? For a while, this administration was very hot on local control, local input, until local input sometimes came up with something they didn't want to hear, and then suddenly local wasn't good anymore. It had to be federal or national level. And actually, local folk have far more influence over projects in their area than anybody else. Because you're paying attention, you know what's going on, you talk to your local land managers, you write the letters, you go to the meetings, you have influence. Somebody sitting in New York City is not going to just suddenly perk up and go, gosh, you know, that trail up Cabin Creek, I think they ought to extend it. You know, that's not going to fly. It's also very important to encourage people to provide the right input at the right time. We have a huge education problem to make sure that people comprehend that after a decision document is signed, that's not when you perk up and go, oh, hey, wait a minute, I wanted to contribute something. But people in the West in particular are getting better and better tuned as to when they need to speak and to whom they need to speak and how they need to speak. Then let's talk physical access. Oh, this is fun. I think in the Forest Service, nothing would strike fear and panic in the heart of a land manager than to have their supervisor say to them, now is the time to do travel planning. Weedy. It was very horrifying. I have seen rangers hung in effigy because they even deigned to begin travel planning, let alone actually make a decision. Travel is, I just started to think about my own experiences with travel planning and was starting to wonder whether I should even get into that. Travel planning is so critical because people want access to their lands, but they want them in a certain way. And we all have to learn to share. And that's been the big experiment with travel planning, is that not everyone can access every acre in whichever way they choose. And I think we've come up with, the Forest Service has gotten a lot more sophisticated in travel planning, and I've seen a whole lot less of the let's do it 50-50. You know, here's a really nice mountain, 50% of it will be motorized, 50% will be hiking. Instead, I think that the Forest Service is getting more sophisticated in that they are looking at what are the values on this particular piece of land, and not just thinking that we have to give half of everything to everybody, which has been the process in the past. You know, there are some very, very direct effects to access, and particularly motorized access. And I think that it's been a long time coming for forest land managers and BLM managers to recognize that the effects of erosion, of weeds being brought in, of water quality issues, of wildlife disturbance, of wildlife habitat fragmentation as a result of excessive motorized travel, that really one needs to be on top of that issue and not allow it to get to the point where you see all these deleterious effects and then go, oops, I think we have to pull back, because it becomes so much more difficult to take something away than it does to give it. And then beyond the personal access issues, there's also the ideological concept of access. And we have seen that in spades in rural counties, particularly in Nevada. I know of what I speak. I was the forest supervisor on the Humboldt-Toyabe National Forest, and actually it was an access issue that caused me to leave the Forest Service. And it was ideological access. It was 1.5 miles of dead-end dirt road 100 miles from the nearest town. It wasn't because there was some critical need to get to the end of the road. It was the idea that this road actually belonged to the county, and therefore the Forest Service shouldn't be mucking with it. The Forest Service shouldn't decide not to rebuild it if it got blown out. The story goes on, but essentially it was an argument over control. It wasn't really access. And then there's the costs that are involved in allowing access or changing the kinds of access. And this can be access not just in travel planning, but access to our priced commodities. Unfortunately, in the Forest Service, the budgets have continued to decline, and they're really rather inadequate for dealing with the challenges that the Forest Service faces today. And that's not only in price commodities, but in recreation as well. There are some administrative options to dealing with these cost issues, and that can be reorganization. And Deb, how many times have you reorganized? Yeah, I can remember reorganizing a forest twice in 3 years. The consolidations, many consolidations of ranger districts and forests, and then sometimes breaking them back apart because it didn't work the first time. Centralizing business functions, which the Forest Service has been doing now for a few years. They forgot that the BLM tried that about 18 years ago and it failed miserably, but we're trying it again our way. Outsourcing, which is a really abysmal way to manage our public lands. Then we look at the sale of public lands. That is not making very many people happy. Representative Pombo, Richard Pombo, who was a very powerful head of the Resources Committee in the House, discovered that the hard way when he was running for re-election. The issue that brought him to his knees and had his opponents win was his desire to sell off public lands to pay a few bills. No one thought that was a great idea, because what you do, you're selling something that gets priced, but what you lose in the long run is the priceless. And then there's the user pay systems. And it's like, well, if you use it, you ought to pay for it. Well, you know, every activity on national forest lands and BLM lands is subsidized. And we need to face that and stop playing games about it. You know, I did an analysis a long time ago, and it probably needs to be updating, but I wouldn't bet that it's too far wrong. And that is that when taxpayers would come to me and say, oh, I pay taxes, I need access to, 100,000 acres with my motorbike, I would say, exactly 1/10 of 1%, or of 1 penny of your taxes went to fund National Forest System lands. So the idea that somehow we're paying for this in full, upfront and ahead of time, and therefore shouldn't be charged any fees or shouldn't pay any fees, that's not really a case that holds water. I'm not necessarily in favor of fees. I'll get into fees in a little bit more detail. But the bottom line is nobody is paying the true costs of using our public lands. How much more time do I have? Are we joking? Okay, great. I wanted to talk about some specific issues. I probably should call them conundrums, because they truly are. And they deal both with physical access and with public input. let's start with the roadless area conservation rule. I'll tell you what, have you ever done a little research on that, tried to figure out what actually happened when? Good Lord. I think I'm kind of a smart person sometimes, and, with my history in the Forest Service, I ought to be able to get this litigation. I'll tell you what, I burst out laughing by the time I get to the third single-spaced page that's describing each of the activities that have taken place. I'll try to condense it and make it somewhat reasonable or rational for you. The roadless area conservation rule went into effect in 2001. It affected at the time about 58 million acres. This was after about 1 million public comments and 600 public meetings. There was a lot of public input. And when the Bush administration came in shortly thereafter, they said, well, there wasn't enough public input, meaning it was the wrong kind of public input or came up with the wrong answer. We had to ask them again because they didn't get it the first time. They asked again, got another 1 million comments, again, 90-some% in favor, like 98% in favor of the roadless area conservation rule. Well, then they tried Plan B, and that was to exempt the Tongass National Forest, so that took out a little over 9 million acres. And then that wasn't really enough, so in 2003 there was an injunction that the rule really couldn't go forward. But there was further litigation. In May of 2005, the administration decided, we might lose this battle, so let's repeal the whole rule and make something new up, which is the state petition process. Well, in September of 2006, the court said, oh, no, you got to reinstate the rule because you didn't use NEPA to use this state petition process. And so then the administration tried to use the Administrative Procedures Act to move ahead with roadless area rulings in Idaho and Colorado. And then Wyoming got excited because they had this injunction, and then it was blown away by the decision in 2006. So they've filed to reinstate the 2003 injunction. Are you confused yet? And sure enough, in August, the Judge Brimmer reinstated the injunction, and that now has been challenged once again. So, round and round and round we go. But if we went back to the beginning, when we raised the question, and land managers who said that, one of my biggest headaches is dealing with roadless areas because I don't know how to deal with it. I get beat up, and if there was something wonderful in there that we needed to get to, we've had 100 years to go for it, and no one has seen it being worth going for, or that the values that were present were too valuable to go roading it, then why don't we just leave it roaded? So all these publics agree, and then we have politicians who don't agree, and they are going to suffer the consequences because I predict in the end we will be back to the roadless area conservation rule. It might take a few more years, but in the end, that's where we're going to end up. Case in point, let's look at the Yellowstone snowmobile issue. Okay, how many times did each of you comment on that? There were at least 3 comment periods on that one, too. This is a real example of rigidity, because it was believed that, okay, it's got to be snowmobiles, they've got to have access, and somehow we've got to find a legal way to make it happen, because the science is completely against us. The acts that really define the foundations and the purpose of the national park system are against us, but we're going to figure out a way to do it. We'll keep asking the public and see if they can come up with the right answer. Well, 3 times the public overwhelmingly said, no, we don't want increased snowmobile use, or in some cases, no snowmobile use. But the idea that the public was wrong and that it had to be snowmobiles. Look at the snow coaches. Snow coach use has increased by 87%. And yet one of the excuses for promoting and promulgating increased snowmobile use is because nobody wants to ride in a snow coach. Everybody wants their own machine. That's not true. So once again, public input about public access, it's ignored, and now we are in this constant Cuisinart, as someone had said earlier, trying to get to an answer that's going to satisfy the needs of public lands, of the biodiversity, of wildlife, and of humans. Let's look at recreation fees. Okay, and I will give credit to one of the co-workers of Reed Watson, Bishop Gruhl, who wrote a very interesting paper, a very good analysis looking at recreation fees. This is a really sensitive subject, and it has a bit of a history, and I'm actually of 2 minds on it. Recreation fees have always been part of the National Park Service, but it wasn't until 1996 that the recreation fee demonstration project was initiated. That is called the Fee Demo, and it allowed 4 other agencies, the Forest Service, BLM, the Fish Wildlife Service, as well as the National Park Service, to go ahead and start charging fees for different services related to recreation, and just sort of test it. It was also a way to bring in additional money so that the federal budget allocation for recreation could be reduced. In 2005, the Recreation Enhancement Act was passed, and that pretty much cemented the fee demo project. It had some other bits and pieces to it, different levels of funding, of fee structures, and it also allowed the Bureau of Reclamation to get in on the act. The objections to it are reasonable objections, and some of them have merit, and some are a little sketchy. But some people have claimed that the fees would price out low-income people from recreation, and really the surveys and the studies have not borne that out. And it really looks like that any decision not to participate in public lands, recreation activities, is really going to be so overshadowed by the price of gas that the fee is going to look small after you fill up your tank to get there. And also there's been concern about commercialization, that somehow concessionaires will take over, because quite often when you have a fee structure implemented, you really have to have a higher level of service than sometimes the Forest Service can provide. So therefore the Forest Service contracts with a concessionaire so that there's a campground host and that the facilities are better maintained, et cetera. And people are concerned that that shifts the burden of providing that unique public land experience to the private sector. But I think that we should expect more of that as agency budgets continue to go down. And then there's the kind of a core issue about the double tax. Well, I pay taxes and then I have to pay to use it. Yes, that's true, but is it fair? Well, if you're using it more than somebody who's sitting in, Dubuque, Iowa, well, maybe it is fair. However, there's been some, I'll get into that in the solutions. And then the concern about reducing federal accountability. And because they think that there's the thought that fees will become such a huge part of the budget that they'll be outside the federal jurisdiction. But that's really not, I don't foresee that happening at all. I think right now fees are only about 5% of the total recreation budget of those agencies. The other concerns are and I think the real core issues, again, we get away from talking about dollars and cents, which people like to frame things in because they think that's the way we have to argue. But really, it's philosophical. It's the idea that freedom is wildness, and therefore wildness should be free. And then there's the idea of access to the priceless. If I want to go look at a beautiful landscape, I don't want to have to sit here and fill out a form and get a sticker. I want to go look at it. And then there's the, one of the ideas, though, that to address that is a different fee structure for locals, recognizing that local people are always out in this land, and it's almost interchangeable with their backyard. And I think anybody that's lived in a tourist town know that if you go in and kind of wink and go, I'm local, you get a better seat and a cheaper price for the beer. And I think that the fee structure, I've seen it, in my experience, I've seen it work wonderfully, and other times I've seen it really not make me happy at all because the results on the ground weren't that great. Use decreased, and it really wasn't a net gain for the public. But in a case, for instance, like the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center, that was a center that was about 10 years in the planning before we broke ground for it and actually got it constructed in about 1997, and it is an absolutely fantastic facility. If you have not been there, you owe yourself a trip there. But it depends almost entirely on fees. Lewis and Clark National Forest is a very tiny little forest. It has a very small budget. Debbie's budget was always bigger than mine. Deb's the supervisor on the Lolo. We used to have a lot of interesting budget discussions. But I couldn't add to my budget. I had to figure out how to fund this beautiful facility that people were flocking from across the nation to see, and fees were the only way that it was possible to do that. And then quickly on public input. In this administration, I have seen a systematic reduction of opportunities for input under the guise of streamlining. It's like, well, if we don't have to listen to you, then we can work faster. That's not a good way to manage public lands. I think that there's been an emphasis on local control, except only when the locals are in ideological alignment with the administration. One thing that really upset me was the wolf reintroduction program. There was a great deal of collaboration and work by locals to develop an appropriate wolf reintroduction plan. And the Secretary of Interior at the time waltzed in there and said, "This sucks, we don't like wolves, it's out." That is such a demeaning experience for people who have participated long, hard hours, sweat, blood, and tears, developed relationships with people they thought they could never even talk to, and then have somebody come in and say, "Well, I don't like your conclusion, so you're all wrong," and it's done. That is what happened. And then there were the changes in the U.S. Forest Service planning regulations, which really broke my heart because it really moved forest planning away from using the NEPA process. It removed the ability to appeal decisions that had to do with forest planning because there are no real decisions now. It's just sort of like a direction that we're going. And we'll use adaptive management, which means things can change on a dime without your input. And then we will not, we won't worry about cumulative effects and really judging what's going to happen from this whole direction that we've set. We'll mitigate at the project level. That's going back like 4 decades. And again, you know, we have lost, when we take away the ability of the public to participate, regardless of how messy, irritating, slow down the process gets, you know what? Public lands are going to be here for thousands of years. We have the time to make intelligent, deliberative decisions about how we manage our public lands and particularly how we access our public lands. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gloria, for sharing your thoughts on public input and access to the priceless. As Richard Nixon once said, public lands are, in a sense, the breathing space of the nation, and I think your thoughts captured that quite well. Our second speaker is Steve Doherty. Steve is a partner in the law firm of Smith & Doherty, has served in the state legislature, and currently serves as chairman of the Fish, Wildlife, and Parks Commission. Steve will share some of his experiences from that commission, and we'll talk about a variety of access issues, perhaps even touching on the hot topic of Plum Creek lands. Please welcome Steve.
Thanks, Amy, and I'll begin by giving you some disclaimers. There will not be many footnotes in my speech. There will be few citations. It will be filled with bias, prejudice, and many scars that I have earned over the last 35 years dealing with natural resource issues in Montana. And one of those biases and prejudices I'll tell you about was I was once a community organizer for 6 years in eastern Montana, waltzing around, sitting around kitchen tables, talking to farmers and ranchers and Indian people about what the effects of coal development might be on their water. Terrible thing to be a community organizer, I guess, in some instances. So, I was in the legislature. I was on the Fish and Game Committee for one session. I found out the old aphorism about, fish and game bills are unique characters in the legislature. It doesn't matter how simple the bill is, it will be debated for hours. And the reason why is everybody knows something about fish and game. You may not know much about bonds or sewers or how to construct one deferred building maintenance at a university, but by God, you know something about hunting and fishing in Montana. So it's an issue that Montanans care deeply about, are passionate about, and will go to the mat over on any particular day of the week. And serving on the commission is a unique experience. Oscar Wilde said he was a fella that he had no enemies, but he was intensely disliked by most of his friends. I sometimes feel that way. Montana has an independent commission to set policy and to direct the actions of the department. The head of the department is a gubernatorial appointee, and we are insulated from political interference, and that's a historical perspective that's important to have in Montana when talking about the commission. So what do? Well, we set quotas or permits for mountain lions. And God help you if you're on the wrong side of that issue, whether they should be hunted with quotas or with permits. We referee fights between trappers and houndsmen. We try and figure out how to recover West Slope cutthroats in high mountain wilderness lakes, which might involve poisoning those lakes out and killing perfectly good fish, the cutbows. And then we get into the discussion about hybridization and what really is a West Slope cutthroat. We get to deal with urban deer in Helena, where one morning I had a good friend, the morning that we made that decision, interrupt my breakfast and tell me that we could start by shooting the 50 deer in her yard, and she'd appreciate it being done by noon. And the lady who was sitting next to me, who I didn't know, turned around and before I could get another bite of my breakfast, looked at me and said, "I hope you enjoy slaughtering the innocents." We get to deal with parks, and I will have to say that this governor has made a commitment by the state of Montana, unlike any other governor in history, to go after lands that we need to keep in Montana. And John Leshy mentioned the Charlie Lincoln Ranch up on the Marias River, and once I went up there and took a good look at it, it was all I could do to make sure that we got that land and made it public land for the people in the state of Montana. We dealt with elk archery, about the permits in certain areas, particularly around the C.M. Russell Wildlife Refuge. We had seen an increase in elk archery hunting in that particular part of the world because they grow some magnificent bulls out there. And they grow some magnificent fees for charging to take people out for a week. And I think if you look at the Cabela's website, the last time I looked, it was at least $12,500 for a week. And we dealt with limiting the number of elk archery permits in certain areas because we felt it was having an impact not only on the herds themselves, but on the quality of the experience, something that prior commissions had deigned not to walk down that path. We heard a lot from the public, and we hear a lot from the public, as Gloria says, and we attempt to make sure that we keep those public thoughts in mind. But Mark Twain had said, and I think this is apropos for public comments, when he sent the note, "Sorry to have missed the funeral, but consider this letter as a sign of approval." So what's our job on the commission? I see our job as to advocate for the critters, the game and the non-game, to advocate for the resource, to advocate for the parks, and to advocate for those who use them, the hunters and anglers, and to, the folks with the boots on the ground, the Tevas on the trail, the PFDs on the water, and the waders in the marsh. Hunters and anglers have not been a very unified force in years past. Reminded me of the Irish proverb of why do they fight so often with each other? They're looking for a worthy opponent. But working off of John Leshy's discussion of Teddy Roosevelt last night, there's another aspect of Teddy Roosevelt's legacy that I think hunters and anglers deserve much credit for the discussion we're having about public lands today. Not only the lands themselves, but the critters that are on them. In the North American Wildlife Conservation Model, it's hunters and anglers who have in large part funded many of the programs that we get to fight about today and discuss about today. And if it wasn't for those hunters and anglers, we wouldn't have the healthy, robust herds of wild game that we now see on the Montana landscape. But there's something else about those hunters and anglers, if I could be a crass political guy for a minute. I don't know how I can ever not be a crass political guy, but Montana has the largest numbers of citizens per capita that have hunting and fishing licenses. Something over 300,000 of us do. And that's a pretty large number when you start thinking about votes. And people have been fractionalized in the past. They've been fractionalized, and the favorite one, it's a wedge issue, and all you have to do is mention the Second Amendment and you forget the other amendments that might be around in the Constitution. But I think hunters and anglers are becoming far more sophisticated and looking beyond the barrel of the gun. They're looking at habitat, they're looking at the critters themselves, they're looking at access. How can they get to those animals that they care so deeply about and hunt? And that's my charge, I guess, today, to talk a little bit about access, because it's key in dealing and trying to manage wildlife that don't recognize boundaries that we all do, or mostly do, or now that the penalties for trespassing for bird hunting have gone up substantially, we all do. The checkerboard, as was said earlier, that son of a gun should have been shot, because it does deal us all a bad hand in trying to relate and manage a resource that moves across those checkerboarded sections of public lands. So what have we done in Montana? Well, one thing we've done, and I'll just mention it briefly because it's important in talking about managing a resource, to recognize that Montana, 65% of the land is privately owned. What are you going to do with the critters? Well, one of the things that Montana started a number of years ago is called the Block Management Program. And in the Block Management Program, cooperating private landowners are paid a fee that's based on the number of species that are hunted, the number of acres that are open, and the number of hunter days, another term of art that I'm now somewhat conversed in, and to help manage that resource. And we're also looking, the department's also looking at managing or helping or trying to get access across certain private lands to large chunks of public lands, which I think is going to be more critical in the days ahead. Because we have seen, and anecdotally at least, that there are certain folks that when certain properties come up, all of a sudden that 40 or 60 or 80 acre section is bought for an incredible sum of money, and by God, there's no more access to that 10,000, that 20,000, that 30,000 acres of public land. And that's a raw deal for those hunters and anglers, and they know it. And, you know, like it or not, there's more of them than there are of anybody else in this state as far as an interest group and a voting bloc. But, of course, they don't vote as a bloc. So, but one of the things that we've done, we now have about 1,200 landowners involved in block management for about 8.5 million acres. The maximum payment is $12,000. And the value that we get out of the program as a department and as a society is that average folks get access to some pretty good lands to hunt and fish. It's a great deal. So, we have block management. We also have in Montana stream access, which is, I think, an issue that needs to be resolved. It needs to be resolved. It is resolved, actually. It's clearly resolved. In my mind, there is no argument about stream access. We have a public easement on a highway that crosses over a public easement on a waterway. And we have problems at bridges in Montana. We can't fight enough about everything else in the world, but we're going to fight about whether you can slip your canoe off a bridge into a river. Now, any of us who's been around a little bit knows the difference between a fence designed to keep cows in and a fence designed to keep people out. It's pretty simple. You know, when it's about 6 or 7 strands high and there's about this much, and it's brand new barbed wire, and you know, and there are very few problem areas actually in Montana at bridges. But by God, where they are, we're going to fight to the death over it. Or there is a section of Montana that will fight to the death over it. And last legislative session, we actually had the Montana Association of Counties got together with the trout people and the fishing access people, and we thought we had everybody sat down at the table and we were going to work this out. In Fish and Game, we were going to pay for turnstiles. We were going to pay for a plastic thing to go over the top strand of barbed wire so you could slip your canoe over. We were going to, pay for signage. We were going to, at these problem areas, because not every bridge crossing a stream in Montana is a problem. It seemed to be a relatively simple solution, but at the last minute, one element representing the few Montana livestock growers who still belong to a certain livestock organization, pulled out and said, by God, you're trampling on our property rights. Now, it's going to come. We already have an Attorney General's opinion. It's codifying what is already what is law. But that kind of attitude, that Johnson County, Wyoming warfare attitude towards the fiefdoms and the serfs, it's not going to pack it. Not much longer. So we've had block management, we have stream access in Montana, and I want to tell you a little bit about Cabela's experience in Montana, for those of you who haven't been in the know and don't, look at your Cabela's catalog. Cabela's is a warm, fuzzy organization. I have great waiters from Cabela's that have kept me warm many a morning in the marsh. And Cabela's decided to get into the trophy property marketing business. And they started bidding on particular private pieces of property in Montana, which is, it's a free market, it's a deregulated economy. That part of the economy still is. And the problem is that Cabela's initially said, and did buy a ranch, bid it up pretty high. It was a ranch that used to be in block management, and said that the reason that the folks had sold the ranch was because they were dissatisfied with block management. Well, actually that wasn't true. I know you'll be shocked that there were people with an economic interest who didn't tell the truth. But this managed to upset a number of the hook and bullet crowd. And they should have been upset, the people who buy the waiters, because Cabela's has been our little outfit that we buy our waiters from, and all of a sudden they're now catering to the rich orthodontists from Milwaukee who want to keep us out of our public lands. So there was some discussion by different groups, and the thoughts of having a burn-in of Cabela's catalog at their proposed new store in Billings apparently didn't quite work its wonders as far as corporate public relations. And Cabela's backed off. And they came to the commission and they said, we've done this in other states and Montana seems to be different. and we said, well, yeah, it is. And Cabela's, to their great credit, having said the nasty comment before, Cabela's learned a valuable lesson. They showed up at the commission. They offered money to help with access programs. If you go to Cabela's Trophy Properties website right now, you'll find that opportunities and profitable wildlife management for private Montana landowners. And they'll tell you about block management basics, a landowner's guide to Montana programs, stream access in Montana, and then they'll even show you a video that the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks produced in conjunction with the Montana Stock Growers Association, calling Owning a Piece of Eden. And Cabela's also promised, and has kept it up, that any of their cooperating realtors who doesn't follow their code of ethics with regard to private lands and public lands and access by the Bubbas, the hook and bullet crowd, that they're not going to be their realtors anymore. They have taken a huge step ahead, and I haven't seen any Montana realtors stepping up to take the same pledge. So this, crass out-of-state corporation that was interested in only profiting came up against an immovable force in Montana, and I think, to their great credit, have done very good work in recognizing our uniqueness and in recognizing the passion for access to public lands that Montana's hunters and anglers have. So, what are some problems that we're going to face? Harboring wildlife. This is the situation in which the landowner decides for one reason or another, whether they're a new landowner or a fifth-generation salty Montana landowner, that they're not going to allow public hunting. Fine. The neighbor does, or maybe there are public lands adjacent to that private ranch. What happens is the elk spend their days lounging around in the lush alfalfa fields where nobody hassles them. Hunting season starts. They run off of the public lands after the first couple of shots. They run onto the private lands where they are harbored, either because the individual landowner says, I don't like the idea of hunting as part of game management, or they say, I really like the idea of hunting as game management and pay me $15,000 to $20,000 a week and you can shoot your trophy bull. And at the end of the season, the elk who have lounged around where they haven't been hassled at that point head back to the public lands, or more importantly, for trying to manage the conflicts that we have, to the adjacent landowner who does allow public hunting access. So that's going to be a tough one. And I don't really have any clear answers on that, but the idea of access to and managing wildlife by hunting when dealing with the issue of harboring, whether it's done for aesthetic purposes or moral purposes or money purposes, is one that the department and folks are going to have a huge problem with dealing with down the road. Leasing and outfitting of lands. Anecdotally, I know that there are places north of Great Falls that I used to hunt pheasants with, my dad and uncles when I was a kid, that it's $500 to $700 to $1,000 a gun per day. That is continuing. We have no idea how much of that is going on. And why is that important? Because it's private land, obviously. You know, somebody's leasing it out. But people also lease out that access to that 10,000 acres that you can only get through that private landowner. So public lands are being blocked to the public as well. And we don't have numbers. So some enterprising law student or graduate student, where's Birchfield, at the School of Forestry Montana would be well served if we had an answer. But it's a lot. It's a lot. So what are we going to do with that? I don't know. Bison management, access to hunting bison in Montana. I went on the commission. My first act was to stop the bison hunt that had been scheduled by the prior commission and the prior administration. I didn't think it was even close to a fair chase hunt. And I can remember one of the comments that we got that was in particular, and God bless those folks at Fish and Game, you know, or Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. They take the public comments and they take them all and they write them down and they report them to us. And being called a tree-hugging, bunny-kissing, bed-wetting environmental wacko was one of my high points. And, you know, for you guys over 50 with prostate problems, you can understand why it was a personal thing. But bison have been managed in Montana in many ways as a pest and not as a wild game species. Now, the governor did go out and make a determined effort to try and get more room for the bison to roam, and they are going to be able to get through a narrow passageway on the north end of the park to maybe get a little more access and a little more land. But at some point, we're going to have to deal with bison, and we're going to have to deal with them as a game animal. And they should be managed by Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, not the Montana Department of Livestock. Another issue that is coming up that I'm not sure whether it's going to take legislation or whether I think the commission actually can do it by rule, and this would be an interesting contest is ATV or ORV use on public lands. And we were presented by the Wildlife Federation a couple years ago with a petition to take some action to require, and I thought it was pretty sensible, okay, a license plate that you could actually read on the back of those motorized vehicles. And the reason why is that, and well, I shouldn't pick on Western Montana, but I'm gonna, that apparently people are getting run over because there are people, you know, the renegades and the rogues in the ATV recreational stuff, and there are a few, and there are gonna be a few, are running people over. They ran over an ex-cop from Los Angeles with one leg. So, you know, why not have a license plate that you could actually read from a distance far away? And the commission majority at that point wasn't inclined to do anything, but that seems to me to be a pretty simple thing. You know, there are places where they're a lot of fun and they're useful, and for folks who can't walk around as well as they used to, you ought to be able to use them. But when they're screwing around where they're not supposed to be, you ought to be able to, you know, enforce the law. I don't know. Well, we then get to Plum Creek and access. The Legacy Project we all love, and we appreciate the efforts of Senator Baucus and our congressional delegation and everybody else, and we're going to be scrounging around in Montana trying to find the money to come up with Montana's portion of that to make sure that we continue to have access to those lands. And let me make it clear, the Plum Creek has been an excellent corporate neighbor. They allow access. They allow hunting and fishing and berry picking and bird watching and generally just, you know, cloud gazing on their lands. And that's important. But when they sell those lands under what I can only surmise to be a strangely concocted, weird Byzantine process involving the Undersecretary of Agriculture, they're a good neighbor with certain privileges. So, and those new owners may not allow the same kind of access. And that's where those hunters and anglers are going to get very interested. So, and the land managers probably need to figure out how are we going to manage if all of a sudden those new landowners don't allow hunting and fishing. Hunting especially is a management tool. So that's a problem. Energy development. We had quite a discussion at last year's Public Land Law Review Conference on energy development and leasing by the BLM for oil and gas purposes. And I know I shouldn't do this, but the Minerals Management Agency, party on Garth, drill here, drill now, has a whole new meaning. I mean, what are these people thinking? The feds, the BLM, has, in the last 7 years, leased more land than anybody, you know, by leaps and bounds over prior administrations. And most of those leases are not producing. So the notion that a disgraced former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives can write a book about drill here and drill now without knowing diddly squat about what's going on our public lands is offensive. And it's offensive to land managers, wildlife managers, because the state gets to do that under our federal-state relationship, that they lease lands without bothering to tell the folks at the state level what's going on in sensitive areas is offensive. It's wrong. It's dumb. And the good folks from the Teddy Roosevelt Conservation Partnership have been out going to rod and gun clubs in every county in Montana and identifying sensitive wildlife habitat. And when they get that put together, and they sit down with the folks at FWP, and we go to them and say, don't lease in areas that are critical wildlife habitat. They shouldn't do it. You know, they should produce on the leases that they already have, and they ought to be going up into the Bakken field in northeastern Montana, for crying out loud. So, but the state, to its credit, in the last lease offerings from state lands, I think out of 141 parcels in south central Montana on the Boulder, Shields, and Yellowstone rivers, involving 48,000 acres, on 16 of those parcels, the state of Montana, for the first time ever, required a buffer zone for critical riparian habitat of 1/4 mile. And the article that I have, you know, the state land board has an obligation to raise funds, and leasing state lands for oil and gas development is part of that. But for the first time, the state of Montana has said in some areas we want a buffer zone. This really shouldn't be you know, in some areas there should be a buffer zone. Duh. But the continued, who runs the department? Who's driving the bus? Is it the people who are going to be making the money, or is it the people who are doing the managing? Those are the critical issues. And actually, there was a quote from one of the BLM folks down in Billings that says, "We're interested. We're interested in this novel approach, right? We are working with all the stakeholders because we want to have a landscape approach to oil and gas leasing. The landscape approach is something of a high priority and of interest to us." Well, bully for them in 2008. And I probably shouldn't be so sarcastic, but it's about time. I mean, these are not really radical ideas. These are not really radical proposals. That out of 141 parcels are offered in 48,000 acres, that 16 of them might have a setback. So, I've now talked about oil and gas and access. And why is that important? Because we've seen dramatic drop-offs in mule populations. We've seen and pronghorn antelope populations in Wyoming and in Colorado down in the Roan Plateau by 50% drop-off in those populations due to oil and gas development, due to dumb oil and gas development. Let me insert that adjective. You know, instead of drill here, drill now, why not drill smarter? More sensitively, more respectfully. We can get the same thing done. So that's important, because if you don't have the critters, it doesn't matter if you get the access. You need access to the critters as well. And I think that's another definition of access that we need to work on. And I can't pass up the opportunity, another issue that we're going to have to deal with at some point is climate change and what it means for public lands. Because those public lands that don't have the charismatic megafauna on them may not be as valuable. But, we may have increased productivity in certain areas of the forestry, but we also may have more bugs living over the winter and causing more winter kill. We may have and are seeing out of control wildfire costs. Water supply problems are going to be more difficult. Ag versus urban is going to be a stronger fight. And I commend to you the Clark Fork Coalition production that I thought I had here. But what is it? Low flows, hot trout. That talks about what has happened in the Clark Fork as a result of the data, the science. And, God help us, we still have in the Montana legislature people who believe that dinosaurs roamed the earth, or didn't roam the earth would be far more appropriate. And they're going to fight about the science or say that there are diverging opinions. Well, bully for them, but the resources are beginning to get hammered. And there may be some good things that happen for climate change in an area of Montana, but there's some awful other things that are going to happen as well. So accessing those critters is going to be important down the road. One other point as far as access. When I was in law school in a galaxy far, far away and long, long ago, Congressman Mo Udall came and talked to us at a conference somewhat similar to this. And in my youth, misspent youth as a community organizer, and if I could sneer as well as Giuliani, I would. I asked Congressman Udall 2 questions. I said, so Congressman Udall, do you think deep down in your heart of hearts that we will ever see reform of the general mining law of 1872 in your lifetime? And he looked at me and he said, no. I said, well, Congressman Udall, do you think we'll ever see it in mine? And he said, it's up to you.
Thank you so much, Steve. I knew that we were blessed with the distinguished speaker that we would all enjoy today, even before learning of your experience as a community organizer. So thank you. Finally, our final speaker today on this panel, we'll hear from Reed Watson, a research fellow and coordinator of applied programs at the Property and Environment Research Center, otherwise known as PERC. And I'd also guess that Reed is probably the only person other than myself in this room that on November 23rd will be rooting for the Duke Blue Devils instead of Montana when they meet in Cameron this fall. So if I could welcome Reed up to speak, he'll talk about the complex public land management system, competing public values, and the application of private resource ownership principles to public lands. Please join me in welcoming Reed.
Good afternoon. First, before I start with my remarks, I'd like to thank Michael and Jennifer for hosting this conference and for inviting me to come speak. As by all indications, is going very well, and I think we ought to give them a round of applause. I also want to, before I actually begin, I want to just kind of preface my remarks with the following. I can't claim to have the experience that my other 2 panelists here do. I'm young and I'm full of hope. I'm not a battle-hardened warrior, so if my remarks come off as conceptual and maybe impractical and not based on years of experience, there's a good reason. But I think it'll give us a good kind of dichotomy or perspective. And the last thing I'll say before I begin is we're running a little bit short on time, so I'll keep my remarks brief, hopefully so that we can have a nice dialogue at the end and you guys can ask questions from all of us. Let me just describe the current situation as I see it. I had written 700 million because that's what the report said, but Gloria says 500 million acres of public land. That's a large amount of property. And this is a quote from the report, and these are great quotes. I'm going to give credit where credit's due here. The diverse, evolving, and sometimes competing public values and expectations about our public lands has created, quote unquote, a system beset by redundancies, contradictions, inefficiencies, and frequent legal conflicts over mission and mandate. Another poignant quote I found in the report was that the status quo satisfies virtually no one. So the question that we're trying to answer here today is, given all these competing uses, okay, for a scarce resource, and by scarce I don't mean 500 million acres is a lot, okay? even if you divide it up, I mean, I was kind of shocked that 1.5 acres per person, that sounds like a lot to me, actually. But 500 million acres is not scarce in terms of how raw amount, but scarce in terms of economic sense, in that it's oftentimes rivalrous uses. So if I like to hike in solitude and not hear four-wheelers or motorcycles, but a four-wheeler comes up the trail and has every right to be there, that's a rivalrous use. That's a scarce resource. We both can't be using that resource exactly how we'd want to be using it. So that's how I define the term scarce. So how do we balance the competing uses of this scarce resource? There's multiple ways, and Gloria, I thought, elucidated several. One was maybe not so practical, but interesting nonetheless, which is divide it all up. We each get our 1.5 acres. I don't think anybody favors that. Being an elk hunter, I don't think I would hunt too many days hoping that elk would walk across my 1.5 acres in the middle of Iowa or wherever it might be. Although I'd probably have about the same success rate as I do now. So anybody who doesn't like hunting, don't worry. I go into the woods, but I come out empty-handed. Another way is planning, and I think this is kind of the status quo. There's competing uses and the poor folks who work at the Forest Service who try to develop ways to satisfy everybody. They go through the travel planning process. That's one way. That's the current way. My proposal and what I'm going to talk about today, contrary to what the description says in the agenda, is maybe perhaps counterintuitive. It's not the privatization of public resources. Okay, if that was my speech, trust me, I wouldn't come because I wouldn't expect to come to return home safely. Rather, it's the application of private resource management to public resource management, public lands management. Does everybody understand the distinction? I am not advocating, nor does PERC anymore. Let me give you a background. Terry Anderson, who's the executive director at PERC, back in the fledgling days when I was not born yet, actually, and somehow I'm paying for the sins of that. There's like a commandment about that or something. Said to basically to garner attention to our nonprofit. Say we got to sell Yellowstone. We got to privatize it. It would be better managed ecologically and economically if it was privately owned. Okay, we've since backed off that a little bit, and I'm certainly not going to espouse that argument here today. But rather that we should apply principles of private land management to our public land, to our federal public lands. Let me describe exactly what those principles are. There's going to be three that I would like to talk about today. The first is getting the incentives right. Okay, all human beings, be they public land managers or public land users, respond to incentives. I'll explain all these in turn. The second is that the decision-making authority about public lands ought to be at the level where the information is most accurate in terms of ecological information and also most available. Third, accountability and transparency are desirable features among public land management, among public land agencies, but not to the point that public land managers are unable or ineffective to respond to the new horizons, the new challenges facing public lands, such as global warming and these competing and increasing development pressure. As to the first, I'm going to quote Aldo Leopold, the great conservationist who defined and created what we would now call a conservation ethic. He said that conservation will ultimately boil down to rewarding the private landowner who conserves the public interest. Now again, I and PERC are not advocating for privatizing our public resources. Simply that same principle, that people respond to incentives, landowners respond to incentives, applies to public land management as well. We've seen some success of this in terms of feed demo. I think that success, although maybe controversial by some in terms of double taxation, warrants a broader application to more of our public lands. In terms of local information, again quoting from the report, the redundancies, contradictions, and frequent legal conflict over missions and mandates which plague our public land management system stem in large part from our management perspective that one size fits all, that we can look to Washington, D.C. to tell us how to manage Lolo National Forest. Much like a CEO wouldn't micromanage each and every decision by his employee simply because it's too costly and it's also not effective, we should embrace a devolution of public lands management to the locus of government where there's more information. Gloria is world class. She's top notch. When she was managing these forests, I wonder how much authority she had on a day-to-day basis and how much of it was top-down regulation. You can do this and you can't do that. Finally, in terms of accountability, public land management, public land agencies should be accountable to the public. Indeed, they're trustees of a public resource. But I argue that rather than relying on NEPA as a emergency brake on every federal land action, such that my buddies in the Forest Service who had a job in timber lost his job because they just can't cut anymore in the Gallatin National Forest. There's one citizen in Bozeman who anytime they even proposed thinning, she slapped him with a NEPA suit and they stopped. He had to find a job. He's actually working trails now. There's different ways of accountability, and the way that I want to stress and the way that PERC stresses, the way that PERC stresses is to use the carrot rather than the stick, to make it such that that public land managers manage their properties in ways that reflect the local community's desires. If they don't, they're not doing a good job, then they ought to be fired. Feed Demo demonstrates when public land managers face the incentive of generating revenues by satisfying local demands, they tend to produce better resources. The bathrooms at Yellowstone have improved since Feed Demo. Now, causation and correlation are not the exact same thing. But more money was staying in Yellowstone, being reinvested in the things that the people who visited Yellowstone desired. And I think a lot of that has to do with Feed Demo. So again, I don't have a long history of experience that my colleagues do in terms of grappling with this issue. So what I'll do instead of telling stories is go through the policy report, each issue really quickly, and describe how principles of private resource management might be applied. As to the first, climate change. Again, local information matters. We are going to experience, by all accounts, according to the scientists, not the economists, but the scientists, the doctors who actually help people, not the ones like myself. The effects of climate change are going to be varied across the geography, very localized. So a top-down prescriptive, every public land in the federal state should be managed in one way according to the effects of climate change is not likely to work. What would devolve the decision-making authority to the local agencies, the forests, to the national parks, and let them respond to climate change as they see most appropriate. Second, as far as wildfire, again, incentives really matter here. One of the recommendations of the policy proposal was that we subsidize, I think this is how I read it anyway, that we subsidize fire insurance for the properties that are built along fire-prone areas. That doesn't seem like such a good idea to me. I think that's going to be subsidizing a risky decision. Just like flood insurance, we're going to have more people to bail out during floods in New Orleans if we continue to subsidize the insurance. The markets say that if it's very, very dangerous to live there, you can live there, but we're going to charge you $1,000 a month in insurance. That's a signal. And if we subsidize that, I think that's only going to exacerbate the problem. What needs to happen more is that the folks at the fire service who are in charge of fire should be rewarded for preventing fires and being able to thin rather than spending billions and billions of dollars to put them out. Issue 3, in terms of balancing energy development, again, incentives and accountability. We should reward public land managers who strike this balance between ecologically sensitive drilling, as my colleague said. Issue number 5, which I think is most salient here, talks about development pressure and the increasing development here in Montana, and how that has made all the recreation demands on our public resource, which is relatively finite, although block management has opened up more public access. The actual federal estate is fairly static. How do we cope with these increasing demands on a static, scarce resource? And again, I think because growth is local, we ought to allow local land managers to make decisions to develop their own Forest Service plans without as many top-down mandates as we currently have. As to the user's fees, again, and I'm going to wrap up pretty quickly so we have 10 minutes or so of Q&A. I think Garrett Hardin, who most of you probably know, is an old and currently dead economist, wrote about the tragedy of the commons. And he said that when access is unlimited, when everybody can access a resource, the resource is eventually going to be ruined because everybody's incentives are going to be to use it and use it and use it, because if you don't use it, somebody else will. I think, although not as directly applicable to the federal land management as say, a grazing allotment, that principle still applies. And I think user fees, and Gloria, I think, did a much better job than I ever could have articulating the benefits of user fees. When users face the cost of their consumption, that cost changes their behavior. They don't use it, they don't overuse it, and they don't deplete it. And although there is some arguments of double taxation, I think it's actually more fair to say if you're a frequent user of a resource, you ought to pay for that more so than somebody in, say, Brooklyn who never would have a chance to come out to the national forest that Montana hosts. That's not an economic argument or a legal one. That's a moral one, and you're certainly welcome to disagree. And finally, the whole bear, and I think the whole reason that we're here today is the eighth issue in the policy report, which is unraveling what the authors of the report called the Gordian knot. Okay, we've got a pretty complicated federal lands management structure right now. I don't think anybody would argue that it's simple. And so how do we change this? Is there any way to unravel that? I think, as the report states, there's some really good ideas. Allowing trades between commodity users and amenity groups is a really effective manner of adopting some privatization, some market-based solutions to this complicated problem, of allowing folks who have grazing rights to lease those to people who like bison, so that those bison can flow off of Yellowstone National Park. Almost like, it's essentially, I don't know if any of you guys know Hank Fisher, who was at Defenders of Wildlife for a while, but has been working on this bison issue. Eventually, he came to the conclusion that the bison were somewhat of a pollution. But because they had the risk of brucellosis, all the neighboring private landowners around National Park said, we're not going to allow this pollution from Yellowstone National Park to come into our herds and infect our herds. So what did he do? Although he didn't have any obligation, he developed this structure whereby people who care about bison can lease and retire those grazing allotments so that there's no cattle-bison interaction. This guy, as it turns out, was the exact same person who, although probably not solely responsible, was part of the brain trust behind the Wolf Compensation Fund. So, okay, we don't have the responsibility to pay these rangers along Yellowstone for the livestock losses caused by wolves, but we'll take that on simply because that's the barrier to this reintroduction. Allowing those kind of trades between commodity users of our public lands and the amenity groups of our public lands is going to facilitate and is going to strike a better balance as per this prompt for this panel. Let's see here. Indeed, there are many practical barriers to applying any sort of privatization principles to public land management. I think Gloria said it best when she said some resources are simply priceless, and I couldn't agree with her more on that. The question I ask and pose to all of you guys before I sit down is, what do you hope to achieve with our public lands? Is it ecological health? Is it economic viability? Is it energy independence? Think about all the different competing uses that you have, that you alone can imagine or you alone practice on our public lands. What is the right balance? It's hard to say. It's certainly harder for a centralized planning authority to tell us exactly how we ought to manage our public lands, because there's so many different uses and we do in fact all own it. I in PERC would advocate that allowing markets to function as best we can, of getting the incentives right of public land managers, of adopting things like fee demo and expanding them to a broader application of our public lands, is going to do a better job of striking a balance between these rivalrous uses of public lands rather than a top-down centralized management authority. So whether or not you agree with any of us, any of our opinions about what the issues are that face public lands management today, I hope that you understand that every single one of us cares deeply about it. I'll tell a very brief anecdote. My environmental law professor said, at some point in time, environmental issues, the debates devolve down to a pretty simple terms. He said it becomes almost religious. And depending upon what you want to accomplish with our public lands, whether it be, again, ecological health, economic efficiency, or just simply access, we can't really debate past that point. I think the best way is to let markets function. As he said, 2 + 2 = 4. That's a true statement. And snow is white, or at least it should be, unless it's some sort of pollution going on. But 2 + 2 does not equal white, okay? And snow is not 4. Those are different statements. And so always consider when you're thinking about how to manage this public land, this scarce resource with these different competing uses, from what perspective are you advocating your position? Is it so you can have more public access? Or is it so that we all, as a nation, have equitable access to the resource? Thank you again very much for having me. At this point, I guess we'll just turn it over to some Q&A. And again, I want to thank Jennifer and Michael for inviting me today.
Thank you so much, Reed. And we'll just open the floor to some questions. We've got several people right in a row up here. Sure.
Thank you. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah, good. This is actually a question for Reed. You talked about decision-making authority, and I think I'm quoting here, ought to be at the level where information is most accurate and most available. And I agree that everything is sort of context-dependent when we're talking about ecological health. But how we decide what information is accurate is heavily dependent on the scale and the scope of the question we're asking. So I was just wanting to push a little bit more as to whether you're saying there's no federal role at all, or whether it's a combination of sort of federal, state, local, partly because different scales can provide different kinds of information that can be useful. Thanks.
Absolutely, and I think just really quickly I'll say two different what is and what I think ought to be, and you guys can probably value the former much more than the latter. But I think there absolutely has to be a mix, and I think as Gloria pointed out, there's guiding principles that are codified in the enabling legislation that says how the Forest Service ought to be managed. Okay, and as the policy report states, Forest Service is currently in Department of Agriculture. Okay, that might need to change. It doesn't seem like a very appropriate fit now, but there are guiding principles from the centralized planning authority that I think are valuable, and they can't be abandoned within the bounds of the law. So we'll ground this discussion in reality by all means. Rather, what I mean to say is, I guess I'll tell you one of the few stories I can tell in my short career in this issue is Terry Anderson, the executive director, and I wrote a paper on Endangered Species Act management, and what we said was, the locus of authority for these different species ought to depend on the species itself. So take a species like the black-footed ferret, who is in Montana and I think maybe Wyoming and some other western states, but it's pretty localized species. The information about how that species survives, what it needs, what inputs it needs to continue and not go extinct, are pretty localized. I would trust somebody at the state level who has more information, more access to information, to manage that species better than somebody inside the Beltway. Conversely, take the bald eagle. Okay, the existence values of that animal spread throughout the whole country. They're in most of the states. Managing that species on a state-by-state basis might not make as much sense. So I definitely agree that it is a case-by-case situation, and I do think there has to be a level of input. Now, how do we go about doing that? I don't really know. That's the 900-pound gorilla, and I hate people who put out ideas and don't have implementation ideas. But I'm working on it. I just graduated like 5 months ago. But no, that's exactly the case. I mean, it's who knows most about the resource? Okay, who knows most about what are the demands on Lola National Forest? Probably her. Let her decide. Give her as much discretion as she possibly can on the bounds of the law.
This is for Steve Doherty. Steve, are you aware of anything that's being done to alleviate the monetary damage to elk farm owners who cannot get rid of their elk farms due to recent laws prohibiting their sale?
I think they've all gone to court. I don't think there's a court case left. And that was their remedy. They went to court and demanded compensation. So that's how the system works. I'm not aware that there are any court cases left out there.
This is not really a question. I want to direct this to Corey Clark. I congratulate you for having a lot of knowledge and feeling and biases towards the management and the roadless areas. And I just want to point out those roadless areas, inventory roadless areas, were identified so that they could be designated as wilderness if they pass certain criteria. And that was done 40 some odd years ago. Many of them had not made that grade. But what I really wanted to say is that they're there for a lot of different reasons, but mainly because they were immature, and Idaho and Montana, a lot of those areas were immature timber, so there was no reason to go there. And or they're immature, vast areas of immature timber blocked access to some of those other areas that might be manageable. And in some cases, private land blocked the access to those areas just because you couldn't go across those private lands until proper negotiations had taken place. So I think that's an argument we shouldn't really talk about. What we should talk about is what do you do with them now, and should they be managed as normal forest lands are, or should they be made into wilderness? And those are the questions. So I think your say is on that. Thank you.
Yes, you are right to a certain extent, and to make a broad statement, such as some of the ones that I made about all 58 million acres, certainly there's exceptions for them. I do take a little bit of issue in that a lot of them had immature timber, and so they just people weren't going after them, because in the Rare 1 and Rare 2 process, there really were, the Forest Service really was directed to look for specific characteristics, and it really wasn't dependent on the age or maturity of the timber. But, all those lands are very different, and some of them have excellent wilderness qualities. Some of them were at the very top of the scale. For instance, Deep Creek on the Rocky Mountain front was the premier in terms of the number of points it got for the wilderness characteristics. Well, it's not wilderness yet for very, very much political reasons. It was the timing but you watch, it might be someday. So anyhow, you do raise a good point that there's a lot of individual characteristics about roadless areas that you can't paint with one broad brush.
Is there one other question remaining? Do we have time for one more?
Is it on? I'll ask another simple question. Maybe directed to Steve or to Reed. And my question is this. We have believed in this society for about 2,000 years that wildlife is held in some kind of a public trust. I mean, it goes back to the Justinian Institutes and so forth. And in this country, since at least 1896, when the Supreme Court said that states hold the wildlife in trust for their people. And you presented a situation that we all know is coming to pass in Montana as a hunter on a regular basis, where often newly arrived people purchase ranches, they kick the public out, and they privatize, basically in my view, privatize what is a public resource. So my question is, at what point does the state have an obligation as the trustee for the wildlife to try to really to undo that? In other words, when a rancher can take an elk herd, control it, lease it out for private gain. There may be a market incentive to do that, but then the state is faltering, in my view, in its trustee duty. So where would you draw the line as the trustee for the state's wildlife in situations that are becoming increasingly common?
I'll start real quickly with that and maybe hedge his bets a little bit. The Constitution actually says explicitly, the state constitution says something to the effect of, although we recognize a long heritage of public hunting access, private property rights trump the public's access to private property, to hunt on public property. It does. I believe it's Article 9, talks about the inalienable rights of Montanans in terms of the environment. It says, so I think the government is pretty well bound right now in terms of what they can do. They can't coerce access and do something unconstitutional. There was a ballot initiative that was recently withdrawn to prohibit fee hunting in Montana. It was out of a citizen out of Billings. That was trying to get at the exact same thing. That was defeated. It's a really difficult question, obviously. Block management, I think, is a pretty good step. We've got pretty good public access right now. But we're constitutionally bound that private property rights trump the public's access to pursue wildlife across private land.
Thanks. Give me a couple of seconds to try and figure out a law school exam question answer. Thanks, Jack. I think there are a number of things that we can do before we have to draw a hard and fast line in the sand about the public's wildlife and the private property rights in Montana. And one of the things that we might do, or a future commission might do, would be to limit the licenses or permits in that particular hunting district to antlerless elk only. By gosh, we created, by maybe the permit system or the license system, the market for those horns. We can also, taking into account the effects on adjacent landowners, taking into account the effects on the herd itself, the age structure, the number of breeding bulls that are left for the number of cows and things like that. I think very legitimately, as a commission, look at restructuring the licenses in that area, and all of a sudden there isn't that market incentive to sell hunts to fat cats flying in on, just to run the table here, people flying in on Learjets. So I think there are a number of things that we can do before we get to that kind of Armageddon issue. But I would also say that, with regard, and when I talk to my livestock industry friends, I try and remind them of this all the time. Digging in your heels and saying no, and we like the Johnson County cattle wars in Wyoming, and we ought to go back to those days. Watch out, because once that slumbering giant awakens as far as the hunting and angling community and the political power that they represent, we may go too far, in my estimation. But I think there are a number of things that we can do before we get to that step.
Okay, I think our time is up for this panel. Jennifer, did you want to say a few words? I just want to thank all of our panelists again. This is a great panel. Thank you all for